Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and I have found a free pattern online from Studio E, and it is a great quilt. It goes together very quick. The pieces are large, but it looks complicated, but it is a very easy quilt to do because there's partial seams. And once you know how to do a partial seam, this quilt will fly together. Let me show you. Now I'm going to use the same fabric lineup called Essentials 9. However, I'm going to change it. Where you have the white background, I'm going to put black. And where they have the darker one, I'm going to put the light. Now you could use either the red or the black. What you're looking for is a high contrast because you want those little pieces to really pop. So you need a high contrast. So where the white is, I'm going to have the dark. And the colored, I'm having the light. I do like to have all of my pieces cut first, even my binding, and I mark them with pins that have letters on them, and those letters correspond to the pieces that you're going to need in the pattern. Now the pattern is actually 4 very large blocks put together. So if you divide the quilt in 4, each corner has its own piece. So we are going to make 4 of these large blocks. And we're going to start from the center, just like we normally do any block, and go out. We're going to make all of the components that need to go together to make the block first. Then we're going to assemble those 4 large blocks. This is 8.5 by 3.5 and 8.5 by 2.5, and you need to sew these together. You will have 16 units. And this is unit 1. Now to press the seams, well, it's going to be up to you. You can press them towards the light or the dark. You can also press them open and flat because with this particular pattern, none of the seams need to nestle up. The next unit that's going to be sewn together is going to be a long strip. So the first thing we're going to do is sew B and E together, and this is a 3.5 inch square, and this is 3.5 inches by 2.5 inches. And when you're finished sewing those two together, divide the pile in half and sew them together. And when the 4 are sewn together, you'll need to sew it onto the large one. This is 3.5 by 8.5, and it's going to get attached. So you will have a total of 16 units. When the long unit is done, you're going to sew on a top thin bar, 2.5 inches by 18.5 inches, and sew the two together. And once this is done, you are done all of the components that you need for those 4 large blocks. You will have 4 of the center squares, 16 of the unit A, and 16 of these long units. The next thing is going to be sewing these together, and you're going to need to use a partial seam. And what is a partial seam? Well, exactly like the name sounds. It's a part or a portion of the seam, not the whole seam. For example, this is the whole seam. It's sewn from the top right off the bottom. The entire seam has been sewn. This seam here is only a partial. It has been sewn to a certain point and then stops. So the rest is not sewn together. Only a part or a portion of the seam has sewn. And that seam is the seam we're going to do to sew the 4 big blocks together. So for one block, we're going to need 1 center and 4 of these units. And that's going to be the center of the block. So this block is going to be sewn onto this larger block. However, we are not going to do a full seam. We're going to do a part seam or a partial seam. So we are only going to sew a portion of it. We're going to start at the end, and you're going to sew only halfway. You need to leave enough area here to work with. So match up the raw edges and sew starting right at the end and go about halfway. So you've sewn a partial seam. Now you're going to be able to just finger press that seam towards the dark side and just finger press it. And you do not need to press that little extra opening there. That's going to be done after. The next seam is going to be a full seam, and it is going to go right down the side. So you're going to take the same shape that you have, and you're going to go around this little block. So the next seam is here. You're going to be able to start here and sew all the way down. Matching up your edges, just stitch right on and right off. So you have not touched that open seam yet. And again, just finger press. The next seam is going to go on the other side of the square. So what we're going to do is you're going to sew on all 4 sides of the squares, going around in a circle. So this will be my next seam. Again, it's the same piece, and it's going to go on this side, going right through that last row. So those rows are going to match up. And so right on and right off that row. Finger press again towards the dark side. Now we only have one side left of this little square to sew. Again, it's the same size piece, and this time take that first piece and move it out of your way. And that's going to leave that seam there that you did not sew open. And you're going to be able to sew this seam here together, coming on and off. And when that seam is done, the last thing will be to finish the seam that you started. And to do that, just fold the fabric back upon itself, matching the edges, and you can sew the rest of that seam. And that completes the seam, and the inside of the block is now done. Now, just as before where we went around this little block, we're going to go around the larger block. So you're going to use 4 of these larger units. And just like here where you did the partial seam around the square, you're going to do a partial seam here. You're going to match up the edges, but when you stitch, you're going to be able to stop somewhere near the end. That's going to give you enough room. So you're going to match the edges and you're going to stitch, stopping before you come to the end. And this is going to be pressed right to the dark side. The next one is going to go here. Just like we did this edge, we're going to continue to go around the block, sewing that edge. The seam's done, press to the dark. The top is going to go right on, top done. Then that last seam here, again, end to end. That seam's done. Now we need to finish the partial seam. So fold it so all of the raw edges meet along the side and along the edge, and you need to finish sewing that part seam. And you now have one of the 4 blocks complete. So you only did 2 partial seams, one when you started around this block and one when you started around the second block. The 4 huge blocks are done. Now we're going to sew those blocks together, and we're going to sew them together with sashing. And how you would normally sew any 2 blocks together with sashing, you will do the same. So you're going to have one long row of sashing that you're going to sew on each side of the blocks. So you're going to sew 2 together and then 2 together. So here are the 2 rows of sashing that have put those 2 blocks together. Now they really do blend in, so it's very hard to see them in the quilt, and that's what you want. The next thing is to add another row of sashing to put those 2 blocks together. And then you will have one very large block. And when that last row of sashing has been added on, all of your 4 blocks are together. And that means the body of your quilt is done. The last thing is to add a border all the way around. Now this has been a very fun quilt to make. It looks complicated, but it really wasn't. It was a matter of doing those partial seams. And it's amazing the difference that the quilt looks when you've reversed the colors, the dark for the light and the light for the dark. I'll put a link in the description to the pattern. I do hope you go and print it out and give it a try. And as always, thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe. And as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.